Hello, everyone. Welcome to the August edition of TAQELAH Meetup. This meetup is sponsored by Appletools. Today, we have a very special guest with us, someone who has been an inspiration to me, and I'm sure an inspiration to a lot of people around the world. Let me introduce and let me welcome our amazing speaker, Angie Jones. Angie is a Java champion and a senior director who specializes in test automation strategies and techniques. She shares her wealth of knowledge by speaking and teaching at software conferences all over the world. She writes tutorials and technical articles on angiejones.tech, and she leads the online learning platform Test Automation University. As a master inventor, Angie is known for her innovations and out-of-the-box thinking style, which has resulted in more than 25 patented inventions in the US and China. In her spare time, Angie volunteers with Black Girls Code to teach coding workshops to young girls in an effort to attract more women and minorities in tech. Angie is an amazing person and a great speaker, and we're really happy to have her here as our speaker today. Angie, welcome to TAQELAH.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to talk about how to get automation included in your definition of done. But before we jump into deep, let's make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about what is the definition of done. So the definition of done is defined as a set of criteria that the team agrees must be completed before a feature can be considered done. So there were a couple of things that stood out to me about this definition. One being that it's something that the team must agree to. So this is a team decision. And as smart as we are as, quality professionals, we are not the gatekeepers to say when something is done or not. Likewise, development should not be able to just charge through and say it. It's a team decision, right? So we decide up front what's the criteria to determine when we're done. And that should not be a gray space. Once we hit those check marks, we can say, yes, we are done, right? The other thing that stands out about this is before a feature can be considered done, meaning whatever we decide on as a team has to be something that realistically can be done within the sprint of time that we've allocated for this, right? So it could be 2 weeks. That's the most common. Some people do a week, some people do 3. No matter what that duration is, we're agreeing that, okay, everything we list here has to be able to be completed before we can sign off on this. So here's a typical definition of done. We say, okay, we've identified some acceptance tests. We've written the code and committed it into the code repository. We have automated some unit tests. So we've written some unit tests, but that's great. They're all passing. We've had the code peer reviewed. We've manually run the acceptance test. So we know that that's all working. And we've documented the feature even. So this sounds pretty good. However, what's missing here? See if you can guess. And if you said the automated test, then you are correct, right? So especially of those acceptance tests. And I ask the question often, if you're leaving the sprint without those acceptance tests or any other, relative integration tests or something like that, can you say that you're really done here? Well, according to the definition that we've specified and agreed to as a team, yeah, you are done. However, what you're doing is leaving every single sprint with additional technical debt, right? Many don't even try to conquer test automation as part of their sprints because this is viewed as a task that simply takes too long, right? I often argue, or not argue, but I often tell leadership teams that your automation engineers are writing more code than your developers, really, when you think about it, right? So you think about a given feature, and developer might write about, this much code for the feature, but to exercise that feature in multiple scenarios takes quite a bit more code to do. So it seems really complex. How do we, let the developers write their code? They give it to you. Let's say it's a 2-week sprint. They give it to you after a week, and now you're expected to write even more code in that week, right? It's challenging. It's challenging. However, it can be done. If you don't do this, like I said, you're accruing technical debt, right? Your stories, they're being tested in isolation. So you say, well, Angie, we've run our acceptance tests. We know that they pass. Why can't we move on, right? You have done that, yes. But how many more features were added during that sprint? It wasn't just the one feature. There were lots of different features, right? And everyone tested their particular feature in isolation as opposed to testing this as a system. Um, who has run any regression tests if we haven't automated this, right? More and more features are being introduced. We don't know if the next story has broken this one. We do have unit tests, thankfully, so that'll catch some of the issues. But what about like the more involved tests, like the integration tests and things like this, right? And so without having this in place, you're accruing technical debt. You're leaving the sprint without this safety measure. So meanwhile, you have your test automation engineers, right? They're typically over in some quiet little silo, or they're working on this technical debt that we keep accruing as a team every single sprint. And if they're doing really well, they may be able to, tackle sprint plus one. But in a lot of cases, that's usually several sprints behind. So in the meantime, we're moving on. We're developing new features. Again, there's more and more features being added, and there's no regression test being submitted for those until months later when the automation engineer gets around to this, right? And there's a really big problem with this. These automation engineers who are in this silo, they're missing conversations regarding key customer expectations, and just all of the banter and chatting that we have amongst ourselves as agile teams. Like, what's the most important parts of the application? Where do the bugs live? What are some interesting customer scenarios we've seen executed? All of this is missed by the automation engineer, and all they see is the test steps and they automate them, right? So that's not the most effective approach. Now we can solve this by, as a prerequisite step, embedding the automation engineers within the sprints. Now this is not enough to get to in-sprint automation. And, sometimes people say, well, Angie, we have our automation engineer as part of our sprint team. They're at the stand-ups, yada, yada, yada. We still can't get automation included in the same sprint. And like I said, this is a prereq step. This is not the ends all be all, right? So let's talk about, once we embed these folks as part of our sprint teams, what more do we have to do? These are engineers who aren't typically part of them. So what role do they play in the sprint team? And how can we utilize this arrangements to achieve that in-sprint automation? So I work with a lot of teams to come up with customized strategies for test automation in general, and in-sprint automation specifically. And, the strategy is going to vary per team, but there are 3 pieces that I found that I'm able to use in each of these teams, and they always work, right? So you might have to, tweak it a little bit or add a little more to yours, depending on your team culture and structure and things like that. But I'm going to share with you the three that are common and work across the board. So one is to collaborate with other players. Two is to automate strategically, and three is to build incrementally. So I'm going to go through each three of these in great detail to show you how you might be able to do this. Okay, so the first step, again, is to collaborate with other players. So who must you collaborate with? Some are obvious, some are not so obvious. For example, one that might not be as obvious is the business. So your product owners or business owners, folks like this, right? And you want to collaborate with them because they have a lot of information about the application, about the rationale for why we're even why we're even building these features. So they can give you a lot of insight there. And the reason you want this insight is because you're not going to be able to automate every single thing, right? You need to limit what you automate. And the reason you're not going to automate everything is, one, because it's just not a good idea. Every single test doesn't necessarily need to be automated. And two, if you do that, what you're doing is slowing yourself down, as well as adding um, additional code that needs to be maintained, right? So you want to make sure that you're automating the right things, and the business folks are the ones who can help you determine this, right? So again, which customers are requesting this feature? Once you know that, you have your target personas in mind. So yeah, you know how we are as testers. We can think of a million gazillion scenarios, and we could think of all of these use cases and all of these personas. But hey, we have 1 to 2 weeks to write this code, right? We can include like everyone under the sun, and that doesn't mean that you don't test for those things. You can do that, using exploratory or manual testing. However, when you're talking about automating the test, we need to scope this down to the most important ones, right? They're running as part of every build process. We definitely want to make sure we're doing the right thing here. And so the business folks can help you understand, like, okay, what customers ask for this? We know that these are the scenarios that are going to be exercised by our customers. So let's make sure we automate tests for those. They'll be able to also tell you how is it being used exactly, right? So give more specifics about the journey that your customers are taking, so that you make sure to incorporate that. Are there other features that they're going to use in conjunction with this, right? So that helps you think about your integration test if that's needed as well. So lots to consider, and these business folks can help you do that. They may also be able to help get some additional analytics and data for you if this is a feature that's being updated versus a new greenfield feature, right? So if it's a feature that's being updated, that's even better. Now we have analytics about how our customers have been using this indeed, where the pain points, where are we seeing conversions drop off, are there any bugs already associated with this feature, those sorts of things. All of that can come into play in your decision to determine what do you automate here. So you collaborate with the business so that you can scope down what you're going to automate. And the next person you want to collaborate with is the tester. So the tester can take something like this. Let's say search catalog. As a user, I want to search the catalog so I can find specific products. And if you were to ask, any tester to come up with some test cases off the top of their head, they may be able to give you, close to 10 of them, right? And this is not all that, there's not an extensive exclusive list or whatever, but this is just a few that could fit on the slide, right? So you start looking at these and they come up with all of these scenarios, and that's wonderful. Again, you don't necessarily need to automate every scenario. So this is a great opportunity to talk with the tester, bringing in that information that you gained from talking with the business and deciding, okay, that's great that you're going to test all of this stuff. Perfect. I don't want to automate all of this stuff. So here's what I think is the most important things to automate, right? And you get this input from the tester as well. They have a lot of domain knowledge. They know where the skeletons are buried. They know where the fragile areas of the code are. They can definitely assist you in this decision to determine, okay, which one of these should I actually automate? And then the other person that you want to collaborate with is the developer. So what I like to do with the developer who's going to work on the feature that I need to automate test for, I'll schedule a meeting, let's say like just an hour meeting or something. And this is at the beginning of the sprint once, they have their assignment and it's been planned and everything, but it's before they start writing it. So I'll schedule a meeting and we review the requirement. And what I like to do is individually sketch out what we both envision that the UI is going to look like, right? So I have my sheet of paper and I'm over here sketching without talking or looking at theirs. And they have their sheet of paper and they are sketching theirs. So we're both sketching our envision of what this UI is supposed to look like. And then after we're done, we'll compare the two. And oftentimes you'll see some variances. There's some differences here. And you want to discuss those differences. So how come, you drew yours like this? How come you have, these widgets or these elements there? And you get into a really good discussion from a tester or automation engineer's perspective. You might be bringing in some really valid points about, well, for consistency's sake, I thought it would look like this because there's this other, relative area within the application that does look like that. And so, I expected this to follow suit. And then developer may also bring some very interesting points, such as, well, I'm using this, out of the box library, and this widget is already included. And so I'm able to just pop it in. And this is how it looks by default, but whatever, you get into these conversations and you decide together, okay, so what should it look like? Are we going with my idea, your idea, some combination and compromise of the two, right? Once you all have decided on the design, you have this final mock-up. And then what you're going to do next is to start hashing out the identifiers on this new page or updated page, right? And there's a couple of reasons for doing this. One is you get to, avoid some of the bad practices where developers, no matter how many times you tell them, hey, I need IDs on the elements, once they get in the mode, and I do development as well. Once I'm in that mode, I'm sorry, I just forget about these IDs all the time. Sometimes I remember, sometimes I don't. You're trying to get something to work. CSS is kicking your butt. Like there's a lot going on, and the IDs are the least of your problems at the time. So you often forget. But there's something about having this meeting and talking about it in person and visualizing the page and then saying, okay, this search bar is going to have this ID, this grid is going to have this ID, this product, et cetera, et cetera. And you start identifying IDs on all the elements that you're going to need for your test. There's something about that activity that sticks a little bit better with developers, right? They start viewing this more so as a contract between the two of you. Because here's what's going to happen. As you identify what elements you need and you now have written down their locators, you can take this. Both of you can take a copy of this paper. And as an automation engineer, you can leave this meeting. Remember, I said development hasn't even started coding yet. You can leave this meeting and start automating your tests right now. You have a mock-up of what it's going to look like. You have the IDs that you're going to need. That's it. You can start writing the code for this, even though the UI has not even been developed yet. And that's a crucial key in being able to achieve in sprint automation. You cannot do this um, as a linear process where your developers take a week to a week and a half, and then they give you a week to half a week to write even more code than they did. That just doesn't work, right? And that's why it feels like in sprint automation is impossible. However, if you all leave that meeting both with this paper and you start coding in parallel, right? So you're simultaneously coding, you are much more likely to be able to achieve the in sprint automation. So, of course, you've written this, you don't have the UI, so you can't necessarily run it yet. However, once the developer is done, your tests are already ready and you just run them. About, I would say mine usually work, I would say about probably 95 to 98% of the time right off the bat. There's going to be a few things that I need to tweak. Oh, they forgot the ID on this one thing, but they did, capture most of them. Okay, I'll add that one ID, or typo, they misspelled the ID or something like that, or they, change something. But usually they'll remember those things because we had that contract in place. They'll be less likely to steer away from the design that we've agreed upon. And if they need to, for whatever reason, they remember that you are dependent upon that and they'll let you know. So it kind of fosters more communication between the two, and the developers understand better what it is that you need to do your job and how you're relying on their actions to be able to do so. Okay. All right. So you've collaborated with business, with tests, with developers. The next step is to automate strategically, right? So you're beginning to automate at the same time as the developers. Are there some other tricks that you can employ to automate strategically? Right? So one is, yes, I've, narrowed down the scope of what I need to automate. I'm not going to automate everything. I've talked to the business, I've talked to tests. I know exactly what I should be doing. I have my identifiers, and now I'm ready to write the code. So you're probably all familiar with the automation pyramid. However, if there's a UI. So let me just explain this right quick. So the automation pyramid is 3 levels. So it's the unit, the services or integration, and the UI level. What this model suggests, and it's developed by Mike Cohn, this model suggests that the unit test layer should have the most tests. So of your test automation bucket, all the tests that you have automated for your team, unit tests should make up the bulk of that bucket, right? These are less expensive to write and execute and maintain, and they narrow down, they pinpoint the issue if something breaks. So these are great types of tests, and they're typically written by your developers. Next, you have like your services or your integration level. This is exercising the business logic. So it's beneath the UI. You're not exercising at the UI layer. And this should make up the next largest set of your tests. And then the final layer is the UI layer. And this model is saying that this should be the least amount of your tests in your bucket, right? Because UI tests are flaky, they're fragile, they take a long time to write, they take a long time to run. All right. So a lot of people subscribe to this model, especially in theory. However, when we're given a new UI page or, section or anything UI feature, it's natural to feel like we need to test it there, right? This is a new UI feature. Why would I not test it at the UI? Even if you agree with the automation pyramid model, you're still a little bit torn when it comes to practice. All right. And I agree that we do need to ensure that the UI is behaving as we expect it to. However, there's a lot that goes into an automated scenario besides just the test itself, right? You have to set it up, you have to tear it down, the navigation, all of this stuff takes a lot of time to write and to execute. And this is where you can get into a lot of flaky behaviors and stuff like that. So I want to look at a few features, example features, and we're going to talk about where on the automation pyramid you think you will automate something like that. So the first feature is to search the catalog. It says, as a user, I want to search the catalog so I can find specific products. Which layer of the pyramid do you automate this against? So again, it starts getting tricky, right? And you think, oh my goodness, okay, so I have to search for products. Of course, I need to search on the UI, right? I need to make sure that all of my filters are working on the search. I need to make sure the search results come back and they look okay. And, what about if I search for something that's not there? What does that look like? What about if I, put in my wild string, what's it going to do? Is it going to blow up? And you start having all of these thoughts. And it's very natural to say, yeah, that I need to see that on the UI, right? Well, you're right, but you don't have to do all of it on the UI. So yes, you definitely want to make sure your UI controls are working as expected, that the data that is being presented to your users is correct, all of that, right? But what if you only took maybe 3 of the 20 search scenarios that you've thought of and you did those 3 on the UI? The happy path, sad path where there's no results back just to make sure it doesn't look goofy, and your one wow string just to make sure, again, it doesn't look goofy or blow up or something like that. And then all the rest of those variations where you're doing long string and short string, and 2 results come back and 1 result, and all of this stuff, pages of results come back, all of this. What about if you did that at the unit level, right? So when we're going to do stuff at the UI, we have to take a step back and think about, what's my purpose for doing this? And if that purpose is already met after one UI test, basically I want to see, how these filters work and the search results, and I want to make sure that the data is presented properly. I've gotten that with my 1 to 3 tests. Doesn't mean the rest of them don't need to be tested. I do still want, the majority of those automated, but I can push those down to that cheaper level, which is the unit test level. And at that unit test level, people often ask me, well, Angie, I don't write unit tests. That's the developer's responsibility. And you're right. It is the developer's responsibility, but we are a team, right? So that doesn't mean that you as an automation engineer can never, ever touch the unit test. That doesn't mean that, right? It would be great if, as you had more ideas for tests, you added them to the unit test yourself, right? How cool is that? That's showing that you're a team player. It's showing that you are a mature automation engineer who understands that just because I have a new idea doesn't mean it necessarily has to go at this one layer that I'm supposed to touch. Okay. All right, let's look at another feature. So this one says, add to the cart. As a user, I want to view the details page of a product and add the product to my cart. Which layer would you do this one at? So again, right, you start thinking about this and you're like, well, if I'm viewing the details of a page and I need to click a button and add it to my cart, I got to do it at the UI layer. Yeah, you do, but you can cheat this a little bit with what I call code seams, SEAMS. So code seams are where you find shortcuts within your application to be able to bypass some of the UI steps that you would need to. For example, if I were to look at this feature again, it says, I want to view the details page of my product. How would you do that on the UI? Well, you'll probably need to first search for that product, and then you get these search results back. You click, well, you have your code kind of look through the search results to find which one of them you're supposed to be clicking. Once you find that, you click on it, and now you've gotten to this view page. It's not really a critical part of this test, right? What am I supposed to be testing? That I can add a product to the cart. What does search have to do with that? Absolutely nothing, really, right? And so what you've done is you've added this reliability on a whole nother feature that's unrelated. And so let's say that search breaks. Now your add to cart tests are failing because search is broken. And when I say that out loud, it doesn't even make sense, does it? Right? You don't want to have to tell, your team like, oh, we can't test the cart because search is broken. Like, what? That doesn't make sense. So what you want to do is separate that. I'm sure you already have search because we talked about that in the last feature. So you have search tests already. And it's very tempting to say, well, I already have the code. I built the framework. I could just reuse that and do this. No, please don't do that. Like I said, you're adding this additional reliability. And not only that, you're adding additional time to your test that's not needed. So this is where your code seams come in. You start thinking like, how can I get to this point with the least amount of code and the least effort, right? What if you just went directly to that page? So most of the products in like an e-commerce site or whatever type of app you're building to get from places, most of them have unique URLs. So let's think about this. We don't have to exercise it exactly as a customer would, unless this is meant to be an end-to-end scenario, which is not, right? Let's get to what we need to get to. So let's just go directly to that page and then click the button, right? That's a much simpler test there. All right. Once you do this, that's much quicker to write, much quicker to run, is less details to maintain. And if some other part of the application breaks, this test won't be blocked, right? So this is a faster, more agile friendly test. Last one. Okay, we have a remove from the cart. As a user, I want to remove an item from my cart. All right, let's take a step back. How will we do this as an automation engineer, right? We're going to search for the product again, look through the results. We're going to find it and click it. We're going to add it to the cart. We're going to click the cart. And then finally, we get to the point of the test, which is to remove an item from the cart. So again, my question is, what layer do you automate this against? Using it at the UI layer, well, I do want to make sure when I remove something from the cart that it's actually removed visibly. And I want to, make sure that the cart still looks like it's supposed to look. So yeah, I want to do it at the UI layer. Well, you can, but again, use your code seams here. So which part of this do I need to do at the UI and which do I not? As I went through my thoughts there, what was I saying? That I want to make sure after I remove it from the cart that it looks right, blah, blah, blah. All of that happens on a particular page. So why do I need to use the UI for all of those other steps that I mentioned? I don't. Can I think of other ways to get this done? So I already told you how to bypass search. I can bypass the product page in this one as well. Why do I need to go back there, click add to cart? Because if add to cart isn't working, now this test is blocked, right? And one might argue, well, yeah, I mean, it probably should be, but no, it probably should not. The point of this test is to remove something from the cart, not to test that the add button works. And you already have a test that does that, right? So that's another thing you want to look for. What do I already have tests that cover this particular thing? And do I need yet another one? So for this one, I would do something like find a web service or something that adds the product to the cart, as opposed to going through the UI to add that product to the cart. That could be anything. It could be like an internal API, it could be an external one, it could be a database call that basically just puts the product there. It could be anything, but I'm searching for those shortcuts within my application so I can bypass all of that UI stuff. Again, faster to write, faster to execute. I'm not relying on any other features to work. All right. So once I've run my API call, which adds this product to the cart, I'm not going to go on the website and click the cart and all of this stuff. Let me just go right to the cart page. Again, dedicated URL to get there. I go right there. The product is there because I've run my API call that took milliseconds to do. And now I can get to the heart of the matter, which is testing, removing this item from my cart. Okay. All right. So again, that was automating strategically. So thinking about the automation pyramid and thinking about what layers do you have to target? Can you bypass the UI at all? All right. And then the final step is to build incrementally. So sometimes there's features that come out where either there's, nothing to test right away, or, there's not enough there for a good automation scenario. So we've all seen this where it's like a part one, a part two kind of thing, like, oh, in this part, we're going to do this much. And then next sprint, we'll do the rest. And then it'll be a complete feature. Don't wait to automate this. Build up the framework pieces that you can in the sprint that it was delivered to you. All right. And I'll show you an example of what I mean. So let's say for this particular test, we want to search for a discounted product. And so I have like all of this code here. And I use TDD as an approach even to my test automation code. So usually that's used for feature code, which is test-driven development, is where you write the test first and then you write the feature, just enough of the feature to make the test work. Well, for me, I use TDD to write the test first, and then I write just enough framework code in order to make that test pass. So this helps keep me scoped to what I need only for the test that I'm writing, right? When someone delivers you a brand new UI, it's very tempting, like, oh, let me go ahead and add all of the elements to, my page object class, and you get carried away. Remember, we're doing in sprint automation here. You don't have that kind of time on your hands. So you have to be smart about this and only build what it is that you're going to need. So everything that I have listed here that's has a red underline, that means that this method does not yet exist in my framework, but I've written my test out. And another thing about this is when you're in test automation mode or test mode versus framework mode, these are two different mindsets as well. You're switching from your developer mindset to your testing mindset and vice versa. And when you do that, it's really easy to miss stuff. I can't tell you, I've seen people like write automated tests that don't assert anything of value, right? And you catch these sort of things in code reviews and you're like, what is this? You didn't even test anything. And that's because it's not that they were awful automation engineers. It was because switching that mindset is really hard to, stay focused on what your goal even is. At one point, my goal is to build the framework. And then at another point, my goal is to test it. So doing my whole test, staying in that mindset, getting it all out, thinking it through, what do I need to assert? And then switching to my developer mindset to build the framework really, really helps me out. So this is using TDD to do that. And if you really want a cheat code, I've just simplified it. This is the same test, but with less lines of code. So I use visual testing for this to be able to say, look, just check the whole page using image comparison. So I don't have to think about all the things that I'm going to need to check. So that's a free little hack for you. And again, when development is delivering like half of a feature, right? So say this is a good example of one. Say that they're delivering a profile feature. And so in this sprint, they're going to just build the form to be able to fill out the thing. So this is the front end part. And then next sprint is going to be the back end part, where when you click on that button, you actually have your profile created. But for this sprint, it was only the UI, the front end part of this. So nothing works. You can't click anything, but they just got this part out the way. Typically, what would we say? Well, okay, it's not ready. It's not ready for testing. We don't need to test it. And you would just skip it and move on to something else that was on your plate. The problem with that is when they do deliver the back end part of this, now you have two things to verify. You have this page, plus you have the finished profile page that you're going to need to automate tests for as well. So I don't like doing that, because now I've doubled up my work in the next sprint and I'm falling behind again. So even if you have like these kind of partial features, build out what you need. You're going to still go through the same exercises. What tests do I want to run? Okay, how can I bypass certain stuff? All right. Okay, let me go ahead and use my TDD approach to write it out. And you write those tests out. And again, you might not be able to execute them at the end of the sprint, but you do have what you can already automated, so that next sprint, when they do deliver the final part of this feature, this is all you have to focus on. You don't have to go to this and try to get all the IDs and automate all of that plus this stuff, right? That's when you're going to fall behind. All right, cool. Okay, so given those 3 steps, now you should be able to add scenarios are automated as part of your definition of done. And notice here, I don't have any quantifiers. It just says scenarios are automated. I don't know what it is about automation, but folks just feel like they have to put some type of quantifier on it. If we look at the rest of these criteria in the definition of done, none of those have any metric on them. So why do we feel so inclined to say, oh, 100% of the tests are automated or something like that? Don't do that. The reason you don't want to do that is you're going to go down a road where you're chasing this metric versus focusing on the real goal at hand, right? So let's say you didn't even do 100. You say, all right, 80% of the scenarios must be automated before we can leave this sprint. So now I feel, remember, I talked to the business, I talked to tests, I've narrowed down what I was going to test, and it's not quite 80% of all tests. So what does that mean? Now I have to like start making up tests in order to hit the 80%. And that's what people start doing. Or they start gaming the system and their focus becomes on hitting the 80 versus doing what's right. So just leave this as scenarios are automated. Let the team decide on the best way to do that sprint by sprint. Okay. All right. So again, these are the 3 steps, just summarizing them very quickly. So the first step to get automation included in your definition of done, you're going to collaborate with the players. That's the business. You're going to talk to them to decide, who's using this feature? How do we anticipate them using it? Is it an updated feature? Do you have any analytics around this? And this gives you information to determine what to even automate it. Next, you're going to talk to the tester. With that information that you got from the business, the tester is going to lay out their test plan, and you're going to work together to determine, okay, of all of these tests, which ones should be automated. Given this info from the business, here's what I'm thinking. I would love to hear your perspective as well. And then you're going to collaborate with the development team to understand what this design is going to look like up front, have a little mock-up, have a contract in place where you determine what the identifiers are going to be for this thing that the developer is about to build. And that way you two can code in parallel. Step 2 is you're going to automate strategically. So you're going to think about that automation pyramid. You're going to think about why are you even testing at the UI, and you're going to focus on only testing the things you need to test at the UI. You're going to utilize code seams to be able to develop and execute your tests even faster without relying on the UI. And And then finally, you're going to build incrementally. So you're not going to wait when they say, oh, we don't need testing right now. Your ears should perk up even more. Okay, no, y'all aren't going to throw 2 sprints of work on me in one. Let me go ahead and get what I need to get done. And also use TDD as an approach so that you're only building framework that you need for your test and not overdoing it, because time is not on your side here. All right. All right. So those are my tips to achieve in sprint automation. I would love to answer any questions that you all may have right now. And here's my contact information in case you need to reach me after this at angiejones.tech. I blog about automation strategies and techniques. Testautomationu.com is the free online platform with all courses for test automation. And then I'm on Twitter all the time at TechGirl1908.
Angie, thank you. I think this was a very important topic, and like the steps that you mentioned, I think are really good for us to try again back on our projects. And one of the things that I really liked was your point about focusing on the real goals and not metrics. I think it's a really good reminder to hear that from you now. We do have quite a few questions. Let me share my screen, and we'll just take as many questions as we can. All right, the first one is from Mahati. She's asking, who decides the criteria for definition of done, and does it vary?
Yeah. So again, the team decides this, right? So that was one of the things that stood out to me in the definition of done is that it's a team decision, right? So this shouldn't vary too much. It should typically always be the team. It shouldn't, hopefully not like leadership kind of pushing it down. That does happen, but when that does, I'm assuming that they do allow space for team members to speak up if there's something that they agree or don't disagree or don't agree with.
Thank you. We'll pick the next question. So Komal asks, while backend API test automation can still be achieved in Sprint, would it be a wise thing to automate apps which might not be stable based on maybe UAT feedback?
Right. So when you say not stable, my idea here is if something is being committed to the repository, then, it should be probably in a testable, stable state. But there are cases like that last example I gave where, maybe in this sprint we did half of the feature, only the front end. It's not necessarily working. Customers can't get to this page yet. And the real stuff will come next sprint, and then we'll be able to test it. So again, that's an okay approach, but I wouldn't personally wait until then to try to do all that I need to do. I'm going to do as much prep work as I can, including automating, or at least getting the identifiers and stuff like that up front. And then, automating the test when it is delivered. So do as much as you can so that it doesn't all kind of trickle down and fall on you at one point.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. The next question is from Soren. They ask, would automating the acceptance criteria be a good starting point for end-to-end regression test suite?
Yeah, I think so. The acceptance criteria is very focused on and usually these are created by business or someone like this. So they have good insight into what they're expecting and what qualifies this to be feature to be considered completed. So this is a great place to start for in-sprint automation. You're not going to be able to do this plus do thousands of tests that are in your end-to-end regression backlog as well. And one of the questions people often ask is, okay, so Angie, look, we have 500 tests that we still need to automate, and we want to get to in sprint. but we're over here doing this. So how will we ever be able to get here when we're focused on this? And what I often tell them is you might need to employ some temporary help, whether that be an intern or a contractor or something like that, who can tackle that regression for you, right? So you already have your framework set up, you already have your rules and your guidelines in place. You're not asking this person to build something from scratch. You're simply asking them to contribute those regression ones so that the team can focus on the in sprint ones.
Thank you. All right, next question is from Henry. Do negative tests need to be automated, or would it be good to just start with Happy Path for the regression suite?
So you can start with Happy Path, but negative tests do need to be automated. You don't have to do every negative case you could ever think of, but if it's a common one or something like that, you'll definitely want to automate it. For example, the case where I said the search results. So I want to see what happens when the search results, there are no search results. So I put in a query, like what happens here? That's something I definitely want to always work. Whatever it might be, whether it just says like, oh, there's nothing here or something like that. You want to ensure that that's happening. But a lot of those negative scenarios I push down to like unit test layers or maybe even service layer if I can't get as low as unit test. And I exercise it there, right? So I've already exercised the UI maybe for one negative case. I made sure it did what it needed to do. When I, have all of these variations, I can either not automate them or automate them at lower levels.
That does make sense. I think there's a similar question. When can we say that a test case can be automated in the end-to-end suite instead of just at the API level?
Yeah, so think about what it is that you're testing, right? So if I'm testing something that's like, oh, I want to make sure that this widget is working how it's supposed to work. In order to test that, I have to do that at the UI level, right? But again, I don't have to do every single scenario that I think of there. And then there's other times where you're not necessarily testing the UI. You're testing that the functionality works. And you don't need the UI to do that. So when we think about what the UI is for, the UI is to allow customers to interact with the application and to present data. So when you're testing the UI, what are you testing? You're testing that the user is able to interact with these controls as they're supposed to, and that the data is presented in a way that makes sense, right? That's why visual testing is really good too, because it captures all of that, all of the need for UI testing in one. But if I'm not focused on the presentation of that data, I can do that at an API level or a unit test level. I'm just testing the data and not the presentation of it. So I won't necessarily need to use the UI in that case. So I always ask myself, what am I testing? And then decide like where is the lowest level I can test that at.
Thank you, Angie. That's a very nice way of thinking about it. All right. Next question is from Ivan. They ask, for end-to-end tests, is tooling very critical in sprint automation?
I would say yes, tooling is critical, not necessarily like which tools you use, other than if you're building something in-house yourself, okay, that's going to take time, because for every new kind of scenario you have where you don't have something already in place, now you have to build that too. So that takes a bit of time. But if you're using one of these third party tools, all of them are, I would say as far as efficiency's sake, are about in the same boat. What you do need to consider though is what has like community support, If you get stuck, how can you get unstuck really quickly? So if you're using like brand new tool, nobody else is using it, there's not documentation for it, there's not community for it. When you get stuck, that takes a longer amount of time. So again, you're racing against the clock here with in-sprint automation. So that might not be the best tool for this goal. However, if you're using Cypress or Selenium, one of those tools that has community, has documentation, you can easily get unstuck, then it's fine. Either one of them is okay.
Great advice. All right, next question is from Jack. What is your suggestion in helping developers agree to and enforce a definition of done that values test automation?
Yeah, I think you have to make the case about the technical debt that they're leaving behind. So when you leave this sprint, let's say you go to sprint +1, you've already lost any value in testing those scenarios or any safety net. You've lost that for the features for sprint -1, right? Because there's no regression tests that were automated. Your exploratory testers are focused on this sprint and testing those things in isolation. You have no coverage. You've left that sprint, you're on to the next thing, you're adding more and more to the code base, you're refactoring, and you have no safety net that lets you know if the stuff you built 2 weeks ago still works or not. So you have to make that case to them.
Thank you. We still have quite a few questions, but we're almost out of time. Angie, would you have some more time to pick a few more questions? Or is it
I could probably do like 2 more.
All right. So I think this is a similar question which we answered already. There are quite a few, but let's maybe take this 2-part question here. So if it's not possible to embed automation engineers to specific development teams due to certain constraints, we've not.
No, that's just another person, Jack.
All right, let me try to find Jack.
Okay, I have lots of questions.
I will sort it by oldest first.
Okay. Jack never came with part 2, maybe. Let's see. Oh, it's not.
Oh, I'm not sure. But I guess it might be around like a question around not able to embed automation engineers to our development teams due to some constraints. So then how do we really deal with it?
Yeah, it's really not going to be achievable without embedding those folks in the sprint, right? If you have them outside of the sprint, there's no way they can automate the in-sprint automation. They don't even know what's going on in the sprint, right? It's just it's not possible. Unless your developers are the ones who are going to automate the acceptance test. So there's a thought. However, there's a cost to that, right? Remember, I said in order to achieve this, you needed your development and your automation engineer coding in parallel. Well, your developer is not going to be able to do that. So they might have to do less features in the sprint if you have them to do the automation in the sprint. So there is a cost there as well.
All right. And I think we'll just take this one last question from Diego. In your experience, don't we need to change the automated tests too much if we start automating in parallel before development? And does this mean rework? And how do we decide what to automate if we agree to automate almost everything?
So, no, there shouldn't be much rework because you didn't just start. You had that meeting. That's crucial. Have the meeting, decide on what the UI is going to look like as far as a mock-up, and you've agreed to the identifiers. So you already know the flow. Like I said, about 95 to 98% of the time, soon as they give me the code, my tests work. There's no rework. Only that 2 to 5% of the time, I would have to do a little bit of rework, which is, oh, they forgot an ID or they put it somewhere else or they typed it wrong or something like that. In those cases, I have to do a little bit of rework to get those to work. But for the vast majority of time, it works right out the box. And how do we decide what to automate if we agree to automate almost everything? Sometimes this comes with pain points. So I do have a matrix. It's a whole nother talk, but you can find it on YouTube. If you just search for Angie Jones, which test to automate, you'll see my other talk where I give you a matrix with 4 criteria. I talk about the value, the cost efficiency, the historical data, and the risk, all of those things. And I show you how to evaluate a test and give it like a numerical value. And so this becomes less like gut feeling about should you automate it or not. And now you have some real hardcore data to determine like if this test should be automated or not. And not only that, you can then, once all of your tests are scored, you can then sort them by their numerical value, so you can determine like what's the most important thing to automate and how I should prioritize these tests, right? So that's a much more sophisticated approach to go about doing it if you feel like I just feel like I should automate everything.
I've seen that.
Thank you. Who passed the link? Thank you very much.
All right. Yes, so I think, Angie, I would really like to thank you for joining us this early. It's really early for you, and taking your time to do this wonderful talk. Thank you very much. And we hope that you will join us for some other sessions in the future as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being tuned in and attentive and all of your wonderful questions. Have a beautiful day.